and welcome to Global Minded's Back to School in Time Like No Other series. We are delighted today to have you join us for the session called Get Comfortable Being Uncomfortable, a conversation on race, isms, justice, moving forward, and the role white people need to play. So we're delighted to have the experts here today. This is led by Dr. Ryan Ross, and I will introduce him in just a minute. But for those of you who are new to the Global Minded community, we are about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, underrepresented, LGBTQ, rural populations, however you can define diversity, into the education, economic mobility, employment, and leadership pipeline. And we do that in a number of ways through our annual event. This would have been something we would have had in person in June if not for COVID. So this is about our 61st session that we've done over the last several months, and we'll be continuing throughout the year for other special topics. So it is my pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Ryan Ross. He is part of the leadership of Global Minded. He has received numerous awards, including the MLK Humanitarian Award. He's been named as one of Colorado's top 5 most influential young professionals by CoBiz magazine, and he's been recognized as the 2016 Colorado 9 News Leader of the Year. His passion for community leadership and education is directly related to his experiences growing up and his desire to pay it forward for the community that afforded him many, many opportunities. Ryan's innovative work can be witnessed through his leadership in programs such as the Kappa League Leadership Development Program, the Urban Male Initiative, the Urban Leadership Foundation of Colorado, and in collaboration with many community partners like Denver Public Schools, the Ethnic College Counseling Center, Gilliam Youth Services, Jack and Jill of America Denver Chapter, Colorado Battalion, etc., the Center for Multicultural Excellence, and the centers at the University of Denver, Colorado State University, to name a few. Professionally, Ryan serves as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Equity, and Inclusion for the Colorado Community College System. He owns a boutique speaking and consulting firm called Stirred Up Enterprises, and he serves as the president of the Urban Leadership Foundation of Colorado. So he is a leader throughout the community, and we've been really delighted to work with him the last few years as part of the Global Minded community. And you'll see in the people he's assembled today that we have incredible expertise to lead this really important topic. Ryan and everyone, welcome.
Thank you, Carol. I can't believe you read the whole bio. That is uncomfortable on Zoom, let me tell you. Well, folks, I am delighted to be able to be a part of this conversation with some phenomenal folks, and we only have about an hour together, so I'm going to jump right in and do some brief introductions, and then just invite you to listen to, I think, a really important and authentic conversation. First up, I want to introduce Representative Leslie Herod, who's she's a legislator with the Colorado General Assembly, and if you are following her, even though she is in Colorado, she is national. If you think about the Crown Act, if you look at social justice issues and legislations, if you look at GLBTQIA rights, if you look at championing just people who need a voice, this is what Representative Herod does. She is my favorite. People are gonna get mad, but she's my favorite elected official for a couple of reasons. One, because she answers the phone, and then once she answers the phone, she listens, and then she gets stuff done. We are delighted to have Leslie. Thank you so much for being here, Representative. We know how busy you are, and it's just a thrill to have you here, taking some time out of your day.
Thank you so much for having me. You're one of my favorites too. How about that? I love you too.
Oh, and it's recorded. I'm gonna have to put that on my Facebook page. Next up, I want to introduce an up-and-coming leader, and he's not up-and-coming, he's already established. Javon Brame is the Dean of Students for the Arapahoe Community College. He's also a member of DAP in Colorado. It's the Denver African American Philanthropist, and he is a part of the BRIC Fund, which is thinking about funding for the Black community, and they have a goal to raise $1 million seed money here very quickly to do some really great work in our community. So Javon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Doc.
Next up, I'd like to introduce Chelsea Williams. And Chelsea is the founder and CEO of the College Code in New York, but she's also an international diversity and recruitment and retention expert. She's worked all over the world and has just done phenomenal work, and is also a vital part of Global Minded. She is hailing from New York City, where it's sunny out, as you can tell in her background. And so we are glad that you are here to be with us today, Chelsea. Thank you so much.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
Last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Clifton Taulbert. He was the CEO and president of Freemount Corporation, Roots Java Coffee Company. It's the only African-American owned national coffee supplier company. If that's not enough, he's also an author, Pulitzer nominee, international bestseller. If you've ever read Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, you are looking directly at the author of that. If you've seen the movie, we're looking at the young man from the Mississippi Delta who has shared so much with us over the years just about this topic, about this issue. And we're going to jump right in. Today, we're going to have a conversation on an authentic one that really focuses on the elephant in the room. And most people would think the elephant in the room is isms, racisms, but that's not really the elephant in the room anymore. We are in a time where folks, right, wrong, or indifferent, are recognizing that we have a huge problem in America. Now that conversation is shifting to, what do white people do, right? Like, there's tons of conversations about how should I be an ally? How can I be an accomplice? What's the difference? Why should I get involved? Does this really matter to me? And we're seeing lots of statements. We're seeing lots of work. And the reality is there's some folks who know what to do, and there's some folks who don't. At the crux of that, I think we have an intersection between white fragility and white privilege. And those are two things that we have to address by acknowledging that they both exist, and acknowledge that they can both create barriers to moving this work forward in our country. And so that's gonna be the lens of our conversation today. There are a lot of lenses that we can have this conversation from, but we're gonna talk a little bit from here and then from the experiences of our panelists. And with that being said, Clifton, I'd like to just turn to you real quick and just kind of ask you, how did we get here? You know, why are these questions so important right now?
Well, first of all, in asking that question, Dr. Ross, how did we get here? It implies a journey has started, a journey is in process, and there are either people on that journey and making a trip somewhere. So how do we get to this point where we are today? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that hope is an essential part of the journey. And when hope has not materialized in the way that it should, it creates another set of circumstances in our hearts, in our heads, and in our mind. It really shapes how we go about doing things. Listening at your definition of getting you to where you are today, what made that possible? I think in terms of the people that cross your path. And those people were driven by hope of your future. But when that future is not realized, and when the dreams are shadowed, you end up with Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun one more time. A deferred dream is how we have gotten to this point of conversation, because many promises have been made, but many promises have not been kept. And when promises are not kept, it interrupts the hope that is absolutely essential to move a people and a nation ahead. Expectations we all have, and when those expectations are shattered due to the reality that what we expected did not happen, and the conversations around that did not satisfy our deepest insides, again, hope becomes somewhat shifted to another side. And when hope is removed from a set of circumstances, we do not bring to the table those things that are essential, regardless of who we are. If we go back to 1861, 1862, we will have Thaddeus Stevens. We will have Charles Summers, two white guys, fairly young, who clearly understood what it meant to be in the fray of what was going on. So there are excellent examples of what one needs to do in order to be part of this incredible opportunity we have to bring life to the documents that we call ours in this country.
Thank you. And I mean, you talk about hope, and that's a great point. There's a lot of questions going around saying, hey, there have been movements before, there have been protests before. I'd like to ask panelists, is it different now? Is there a different sense of hope? Is there a different sense that change is going to come this time? What do you guys think? We'll start. Yeah, there we go. Start with Representative Harris.
Yeah. So thanks again for having me. I love seeing all of the folks in the comments in the chat talking about where they're from, so we can get a sense of who everyone is. And oh my, what an audience you have! It's quite amazing. I would definitely say things have changed. That this is more than a moment. We are in a movement that is creating real change, from at least from my perspective. And I have two examples. So for me, I'm a legislator. I pass laws, right? And it was interesting to get the Crown Act passed. The Crown Act is a law now in Colorado where you can no longer discriminate against people based on their ethnic hairstyles, right? In education, housing, and employment. And yes, we had to do it in housing. The stories are ridiculous, right? But they're real. And so, you know, we passed that bill, but we actually did not have a lot of Republican support on that bill. Even though folks agreed that it was a proxy for race, they thought it was more important that employers got to decide who they hired and that schools decided what their dress codes were, even if it discriminated against the way that someone naturally grows their hair out of their head. We passed the bill with support from a lot of actually the business community, which was, I think, surprising to a lot of folks. The unions, the schools, everyone came on board. So it was great here in Colorado. So I say that because we're able to get momentum here. But without that Republican support, it was interesting to me. But then when we took a recess for COVID and then came back, I started working on police reform right away. Senate Bill 217 is being called the most, the largest response, police reform, sweeping police reform across the country for any state to move forward. And we did it here in Colorado, and we did it first. And that bill did things like end qualified immunity, which holds law enforcement officers personally accountable and liable for their actions if they violate someone's constitutional rights in bad faith. It requires body cameras. It does a lot, and we can go into that if you want, but the bill is sweeping, right? And the reason why I know that there's a change is because the reason the bill was brought forward was because of not a legislator, but because of protesters, right? Because of people out in front of the Capitol every single day demanding justice for George Floyd, and then also Elijah McClain, and also Javon Bailey, and all the names, local names that we have been hearing about here in Colorado. But it wasn't just happening in Denver or in Park Hill, where I live. It was throughout the state of Colorado. We heard support from the Western Slope, the Eastern Plains, Northern Colorado, all saying that we needed to pass this bill. And at the end of the day, we only had 2 no votes from the Senate. So that means the majority of the vast majority, overwhelming majority of conservative Republicans supported the bill as well. And I asked them why. I said, what Black person got to you? Who got to you on this bill? Because I'm shocked, you know? And they straight up told me, like, it is real, and we have to start addressing the fact that racial inequality is real, that people are being treated differently, and that folks just need to be held accountable when they have a badge and they're here to serve and protect. Now, Ryan, how long have we been talking about this issue? How long have we been talking about police accountability? But to see, honestly, white folks saying that it mattered showed me that we are in a different time, and we got that bill passed with overwhelming support, period, you know? The other thing I wanted to say real quick, and I'll keep it short, was I had also been working to oppose every year, and my predecessor, Rosemary Marshall, had been doing the same, to oppose a bill that would make it a criminal offense to text and drive, okay? And allow you to get pulled over for that. Now, I don't believe you should text and drive. Distracted driving is not a good thing, and it's already on the books as a crime. And texting and driving is already a secondary offense in Colorado, meaning you can't pull someone over for it. But if they get caught with it, they will have enhancers on their ticket. But having it as a primary offense just gave reason for them to pull over more Black and brown folks and low income people, and it be a my word versus your word. Was I on the phone? Was I not? Now, I have been working with bicycle advocates to help them understand why I had to oppose every year. And Park Hill is a very big bicycle community. And they didn't get it. So I met with them recently, and they want to talk to me about their legislative agenda, thinking that we're going to talk about the same thing. They came to me and said, we have pulled this off of our agenda because we know it has adverse effects on the Black and brown community. We get it now. How can we work together to keep our streets safer? Huge, right? Again, a huge shift in things that people have been saying for a very long time, folks are finally getting. So there is a shift right now. Now is more than just a moment in history. It is a movement, and it will result in real change if we keep the pressure going.
Right.
Yeah. I want to jump in there, Doc, because I think I would argue that this is not the first time this has happened in history, right? When we think about history, there are these moments in our society where interest convergence happens and there's great progress and great change, right? And we've learned from the Civil Rights Movement, right? When the Civil Rights Act was passed and Dr. King was leading this movement, we've learned what can happen. And we're using that as an example of how we need to shift what we're asking for in this moment, right? And so we're talking now about dismantling a system, right? We need white people to say, hey, it's time for us to dismantle this system and rebuild it in a way that is more equitable for those who are most marginalized within our society. And if we don't do that, our institutions will begin to fail, right? As we talk about the emerging majority of people who are going to be in this nation, we have to really be committed to this work. And so I'm really interested to see the things that we demand during this time and how successful we are in getting them done. Because if we don't get them done, it will paralyze the next generation of people. And we cannot afford for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead. No.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, Javon speaking was having me think about this next generation. And I think my lens in terms of impact from an employer standpoint, College Code helps organizations develop and retain diverse talent. So our focus has been on business. How are organizations reacting in this moment? And I absolutely co-sign, what has been shared, because we are seeing organizations that never would have thought about diversity or inclusion or equity or ever want to have any conversation on racism or bring a speaker in to talk about race doing that now. And I would say the biggest thing that we're seeing is employees uprising is kind of a big term to use, but uprising and saying, we demand that our leadership, we demand that our board of directors, we demand that our partners take this seriously. This is not just a cute little initiative, a Black Lives Matter black box post on Blackout Tuesday. We need to see some actions. And we've seen that from fashion and beauty to retail, people saying on social media, show us your executive team, show us your board of directors. And so there is this heightened level, I think social media in many ways has probably helped this, heightened level of expectation from employees and this next generation of workers. This is what they're going into as their baseline. So it's going to be even more important that this isn't just something we're talking about, but we have actions to back it up.
And I think that a generation of younger people, that generation has awakened itself to their responsibilities as well. And that means a lot, because I spent this morning at a breakfast simply to talk about one thing. The breakfast really went into about a couple of hours, and we went back in history and time to a conversation with a group of people that probably would not have asked this 2 months, 3 months, or 5 months ago. And we sat there and I watched them take notes that I thought I would never see on those conversations that are so important to have. But what I'm finding is that when you live in a comfort zone, you tend not to know what's going on in the other zones. And some people really have no idea of this journey that African Americans made. Even though we are side by side as neighbors in our country, they are literally learning, many for the very first time, I had no idea. And so how do we deal with, I had no idea? How do we galvanize the knowledge that is essential to become a spokesperson for that, so that our stories are really known, and that we know our stories, and that our children know our stories, because that's who we are, and who we are is a vital part of who America is.
You know, great points, everyone, and going, you know, kind of following up on that, the telling of stories, right? When we think about Selma and what happened, and the way the world caught a hold of that was mainstream media, right? When we think about George Floyd and some of the other things that have happened, we've seen social media, a different form of media, picking this up and telling these stories. What are your thoughts just on the power of social media and how we need to continue to leverage it or not leverage it? But, you know, what is the power in telling the story and using social media to continue this work, and how has it been effective for you?
I'll hop in because I'd mentioned it before. I mean, I think it's essential. I think there's been so much revealing, so much community building, so much authenticity that's happened over social media. I think that it's one of those things that, again, when I think about organizations that are saying, okay, we can no longer have DE&I be a checkbox. A lot of the reason why they're saying we have to make this commitment is because employees are saying, we demand this. Again, I go back to the pull up or shut up challenge that's happening in some industries and sectors that's saying, show us your board of directors. We want to see this. Customers saying, I'm not buying from your brand. If it's a brand, I'm not buying your product unless you show us this. Influencers saying, I'm out if you don't show us the representation, because it cares to me that Black and brown people are seen in your leadership, in your hiring. I mean, that it's the reality. So whether or not people want to see it or not, it is where we are. So there's a bit of this change movement that, you know, we've got to get on the bandwagon of where we're going if we really want to see longstanding change.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, one other point too. This is probably the first time that I have seen, and I'm older than all of you all, maybe even collectively older than all of you. But this is probably the first time that I've seen the world paying attention to what is happening to African Americans in this country. Because the information that I get, the letters, the notes, the emails, with poignant questions, with no answers, looking for answers, clearly understanding that something can be done, something should be done, and now is the time to do it. I don't think we've had this level of galvanizing, even historically, as we currently have right at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I would just say, make no mistake, we would not be having this conversation even today if it weren't for social media. The fact that we all saw George Floyd die, be murdered over and over and over again on our timelines. I tried to avoid it 4 days and could not, right? Like I kept seeing more and more and more of it. We would not be here. So we need to utilize social media as a strength and a way that we can actually tell our own stories very clearly. Make no mistake, right? Our local media and local journalists are under attack as well. And so we need to be able to round out our own stories, tell our own stories, and help them even lift up our local media and journalists who are being kind of pushed out of the story as well. But it happens through social media. So when I was out in the protests, the reason why they knew I was there, or they knew what was going on, or they had came out, was because we were live streaming, right? We started live streaming, and then press started to come, and then the press started to live stream. They're using their own social media too, even if they're not approved to be there, you know? So they use their social media, and that's how things have grown. And we've actually been able to get real live answers to our questions and evidence about what's really going on in the streets, even if we're not there. And that keeps this movement going. But you're right, protests might die down, and we got to figure out what we want to do with that. And that is utilizing the power we have in social media in different ways to continue to tell our stories, and even continue to have uncomfortable conversations and ask questions. this is where that happens, you know? And so I think social media is key, it's essential, but it's a part of the toolbox, right? You can't just be a social media, what do you call them, a Facebook gangster, and then not actually back that up with getting real work done, you know? And so that is the other piece of it. But having someone who's good at social media or taking that in is so important. And it is almost a full-time job, right? Like you need to have expertise in it, but you can gain that pretty quickly. And so I think it is essential, something that we all must participate in. And even you all, and folks who are in the education space here, you know, you guys know the power of social media, you know the influence you have, and you know that it's magnified right now because we're in the midst of a global pandemic. But that's not gonna go away. It's only gonna shift, change, and grow. And so it's incumbent upon us to be a part of it, especially if we wanna create effective movements.
Yeah, I have to piggyback on all of that. It is my view that social media is the MRI machine to find systemic racism, right? And so as an educator, I use those videos of George Floyd being murdered. I recently rewatched Sandra Bland being ordered to get out of her car from that police officer. And it's that same behavior, it's that same sickness that exists within our society that creates equity gaps within higher education, right? It's those approaches and those mentalities, those ideas, those implicit biases that create situations in every system of our society that disproportionately marginalize people of color. And we've got to do better.
Absolutely.
So you guys all, so we talked about social media there, but you guys all touched a little bit on the pandemic. So I've been in some conversations with some of our white counterparts who said, hey, without the pandemic, I don't know that I would have seen George Floyd. I don't know if my life would have slowed down enough for me to care. And that's as an African American male, that's hard to hear, that it took a national pandemic to get people to recognize inequity. So what would you say about what the pandemic has done to shine a light on inequity, and just kind of respond to that, because it's kind of loaded, and I just want to just put that out there for you.
I had to reflect on that one. I think it's clear, right? Like Black and Latinx and Asian and Native Americans are being, are dying disproportionately from the pandemic. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal this weekend. I believe it came out yesterday, and it broke out every demographic where this was happening. And it's also exacerbated, inequities in systems that we already knew. So when we look at healthcare, when we look at education, when we look at economics and who's, filing for unemployment, you can see the trends in every aspect. And so I do think the pandemic has forced us to stop as a society. And it's one of the reasons why, we've been pushing so hard to reopen everything, right? It shows a blatant disrespect and disregard for the lives of people of color who are on the front lines. And people do not even realize that they are reinforcing systemic racism by saying, hey, I need you to come to work, to that Black employee who has a high level of anxiety, about being in the space because grandma just passed away last week from COVID, right? And so if we are not willing to sacrifice money and economic dominance in the world for the lives of people of color, we're reliving, this oppressive system all over again. And I've just not seen our society want to stop and say, we're going to protect your life and we value you.
Yeah, I think the pandemic, listen, if our foundation in this country was already cracked, right? We just didn't always see it. It's almost like, because I don't think we ever really had truth and reconciliation, right? We never have really dealt with the trauma that this country has placed on Black folks, brown folks, Indigenous people. Keep going, and so our foundation is cracked, but we froze what was going on underneath a little bit. So it was a little bit unseen. And I believe that as we have gone through these last few years of folks kind of heating up what was frozen under the surface and it coming out the top, right? That we've seen, especially as Black folks, but as a lot of people have seen just how racist and how messed up our society is systemically, you know? People are starting to address that. But then the pandemic came and it literally boiled over everything, right? Every single crack was exposed. Nothing that was frozen stayed that way. When it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to equality in business, across the board, it is in everyone's faces. It is real. And so now we have to figure out when we want to create this new foundation, because we've toppled over everything now. But with this new foundation that we're creating, are we going to address the cracks? Or are we just going to try to put some concrete over it and wait until the next time we boil up? You know, that's not going to work. We have to create new systems that literally address and acknowledge the harms that have been caused and figure out a way forward for everything. So for instance, if we're talking about getting the economy back on track or getting schools back open, and we're not talking about equity, and we're not talking about the inequalities in our system, we're doing ourselves a disservice and a disjustice, because as we move forward, those cracks will come back up and we will continue to be left behind and even further behind as people of color, women, and queer people. And so, you know, this pandemic has given us a unique opportunity to really address some of the root causes of the systemic racism that we have all felt for generations. We have actually the ability to fix that right now. And it's not just at the policy level, but it's everywhere, right? It's at our own kitchen tables. It's in our neighborhoods. It's at our businesses. It's in all of these conversations where now is the appropriate time to speak up. Now is the appropriate time to ask questions. Now isn't the right time to pretend like it doesn't exist, bury our head in the sand, or just layer over another thin layer of concrete and think that we're going to fix anything.
Representative Leslie, I co-sign everything you just said. It was so spot on. I'm like, yes, 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 yes. And I think that you just said also another elephant in the room. People sometimes when it comes to racism or we're talking about inequity, they're like, well, there's nothing I can do. It's a policy thing. It's a leadership thing. These people can solve it and I can't do anything. And what you just said, for everyone who's a participant who's here today, everyone can play a role in the solution. It doesn't matter what your industry or sector is. It doesn't matter what your level is. Everyone can be a part of the solution, because to your point, this is boiled over everywhere. And so whether it is thinking about our mindset, our attitudes, our behaviors, you were talking about around the kitchen table, some of the most powerful moments I've heard happen in some of the training I do with organizations is people saying, our family has had some very real conversations, multi-generational conversations that have never happened. And I think that, you know, we could say, is that helpful? It is. It's critical that family structures start to have these conversations as we think about what's next. So as you were speaking, it was just really highlighting, there should not be a person who is here today, and I don't believe so because you've tuned in, who would say there's nothing I can do. Because there's something that everybody can do to be a part of the solution. And to Representative Leslie's point, now's the time. Because we're either part of the solution or part of the problem. There's no gray area now. And so it really provides an opportunity for each of us to really say, what's my sphere of influence? And everyone has a sphere of influence. And what is that next step or steps that I need to take now to be a part of the solution?
So, man, you guys just said a whole word right there. So let's talk a little bit about privilege and fragility, right? So a lot of times in this conversation, we hear things like, I didn't know, I didn't do it, I'm not my great-great-grandfather, or this is so intense, let's not talk about it, or let's sugarcoat what's really happening so we don't have to address this. And this is sometimes the attitude that we see in our white counterparts. And then the other side to that is we see, hey, this is wrong, I want to help, I don't know how. So what can folks be doing with their privilege, and how can they manage around or totally eradicate their submission to fragility in order to participate in this movement?
One thing to keep in mind when you think of the word privilege, people can be privileged without having ever thought about it. That's why it is such a monster to deal with, because privilege does exist. When you're born in a certain place, certain time in history, certain locale, whatever those circumstances are, an 18-wheeler pulls up behind that birth and start putting things in. And Peter Senge probably says it's best when he talks about the mental models that we all have that comes just from being born into a certain place at a certain time in history. Privilege comes along with that for many people. But because no one stopped and tell you at the 6th grade or the 12th grade, now you got this because of privilege, it just happens automatically. And that's, so how do you get it out the automatic so that people can realize, yes, privilege is a reality, it does exist, and there are many people who are beneficiaries of it, and there are some people who watch it happen all the time and clearly understand what privilege is. So I think the conversation around dismantling the non-knowledge of privilege is an essential thing to do so that people can begin to clearly understand what privilege is, where it shows up, and the impact that it has.
Yeah, I really need white people to do their work, and not expect people of color to always be the leader in them doing their work. You know, we are an educated society, both formal and informal, and there are tons of resources out there in the world for people to draw from and pull from to understand where we are now and how we got here. And it is vital that white people begin to engage in that way and take it on as a responsibility and not just something that happens by happenstance. When you talk about the privilege and the fragility piece, I almost think fragility is much more dangerous than the privilege piece, as we've seen play out, right? Like when we're pulling on experiences like Amy Cooper in Washington or in New York, and her calling the police on the, you know, the bird watcher, the African-American bird watcher, and actually weaponizing his race and like knowing that she has the power to do it. And then she begins crying, you know, as if he has done something to her. That fragility kills people. And so understanding that and fighting that internally is like working against your implicit biases is a vital piece of us shifting what is happening in our society. And I often think about just different experiences that I've had in different spaces. And the white people who really get it are able to have such a positive impact. I mean, even as we talk about like diversity work and white people engaging in diversity work, Tim Wise makes much more money than a lot of people of color who are engaging in that work, right? But it's because other white people will listen to him. And so we need white caucusing to take place. And there's also this piece of any group that has ever been in power has not ever necessarily willingly gave up that power to benefit others. And we're asking for that to happen in the United States in some ways, for that power and privilege to be acknowledged so that we can shift. But also realize that in societies where they haven't been able to figure this out, it has come to violence, right? And we're in a place where, if you ever hear President Obama talk about this, you know, we don't want that in our society. We don't want to have to burn down buildings. People will not continue to just allow you to oppress them, right? There's a shift, a point at which that shift is necessary.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that this is another sign that we are in something that's really sustainable. And we have an opportunity to create something that looks really different moving forward. So I was at another one of these conversations, and a woman came on in the chat and basically said, I thought I was colorblind. Trigger for all of us. We know that means not good. And we can talk about that if you want to, but I thought I was colorblind. I've lived my entire life, right, in Northeast Denver, raising my kids, all this stuff, older woman. And I realized now that I have what she called unseen racism, and that she has actually been a part of that, right? She's been a part of that system. She said things, she's done things, she was active, right? And even a white person acknowledging that shows movement, that shows change, that shows that she's doing her work. And that for me was like very moving, right? Very impactful for someone just to be able to come out and say that with their name attached to it, right? Like come out and say that like you thought you weren't racist, but realized you were, right? And trying to unlearn some of the things that you've learned and teach your kids who are now grown adults how to unlearn that stuff with you. That's where she feels like her role is unlearning with her family, you know? And that's hugely important. But as Ryan said, there are so many opportunities, and Javon said there's so many opportunities to educate yourselves. You can Google how to be a good ally and you'll get a pretty darn good list, you know? And I say start with any of those things and that'll be a good thing. You know, we can tell you obviously step back and let people of color step up and lift up their voices. Don't just step back and be like, well, this ain't gonna work, but step back and actually lift up actively. That's always helpful. But the other thing that I wanna say is that again, we have an opportunity in COVID. And people were maybe less comfortable really finding diverse friends, really going to diverse places, you know, and really expanding their network. That was really uncomfortable for people, and it still is. I get it, it's uncomfortable for me. But now we're in Zoom and we got this little box with our face, even if we show up or not. We can go to a Black church on Sunday morning and see what that feels like. And not have to like put ourselves out too much. You can leave the screen off if you don't feel comfortable, but you can go see what it's like at a Black church in the morning, you know, on Sunday morning. You can go do a dance with Cleo Parker Robinson dance and put yourself in that situation in a way that you have a little bit more control over your comfort level and if you're being seen or not seen and what you're doing, right? You can go to a conversation with a group, you know, that's completely different from you and really kind of embed yourself. Maybe it's even just in a book club, you know, all virtually. And those conversations are really helpful so that when we come out of this pandemic and we are hanging out together and we are doing these things, you feel a little bit more comfortable saying, you know what, I want to go to Cleo today. You know, what I thought was only for Black people is actually not. Or I'm gonna go over to La Raza Park and we're gonna hang out, you know, because I feel more comfortable in those situations now because I've experienced them, even if it is virtually and a little bit lower barrier.
Yeah, and I'll just add on, you know, I was peeking in the Q&A. So I saw a Q&A someone had regarding, you know, how to take that next step. And I think there's not a shortage of opportunities to be a part of the solution. And I think we've just given you a lot. I co-sign. If you Google now, or if you go on LinkedIn, there are some very powerful articles. Maybe we can share it through Carol of steps that you all can take, resources that you can dive into. But I go back to thinking about your sphere of influence, your families, your children. If you are a manager and you manage people, and particularly if you have a multicultural team, ethnically diverse team, if you don't, well, that's an opportunity in and of itself. But the whole point is there's so many different ways that you can take a step back and say, how can I be a part of the solution? Are you supporting Black businesses? Back to Representative Leslie's point about COVID-19, who did not get government support? In vast majority, Black and brown businesses. So supporting Black and brown businesses, Black and brown suppliers, if you're at a company that brings in any type of suppliers, if you're on panels and you're thinking about speaking. I saw a very powerful post on LinkedIn, a white woman who was speaking on a panel. She was in an email chain with all the panelist speakers at this big conference. They were all white. She went back to the organizer and said, hi, you know, I appreciate the invitation here. It's really important that I know that there's qualified Black talent out there. It's important that I give up my seat to a Black voice. Here's a list of people that you can reach out to, okay? And that's the kind of stuff it takes. So for people here who are willing to do that, that is actually how you have to be how you can be a part of the solution. But all of those are examples about saying who's not represented, whose voice has historically not been present, who's being promoted, who's seen as a thought leader. I mean, all those questions we can sit with. And once we are able to reflect on those questions, we can take action to elevate other people or say, this is how we've been doing things before. It's been blinded or maybe I have been operating in a blind spot, and now there's an opportunity to partner with other organizations or tap into, again, those people in our sphere of influence who can be a part of helping to create more inclusive spaces.
Yeah. And so in the chat, somebody said, what is white fragility? They hadn't heard the term before. And essentially, just very quickly, what white fragility is when there's discomfort or defensiveness from white people when the topic or the subject of racial inequality or injustice comes up, right? So somebody begins to talk about slavery and you're like, oh, the shriek, I don't want to do this. It didn't really happen. All those kinds of things to limit the conversation and shut it down. That's what fragility really that's what it is. And what it looks like is, it looks like the bystander effect, right? If you've ever seen or heard of the bystander effect, you can Google that, and it just looks like you have the ability to help someone, but you just keep walking by because, you don't know anything about it, or it doesn't have anything to do with you specifically. This is a powerful conversation, and it's a short conversation because we only have an hour, and I know we could talk about a lot of this stuff for a long time. But as we begin to wind down, one of the questions out there is, all right, I want to be an ally, or I want to move from ally to accomplice, or I'm in a leadership position and I don't know how to have this conversation or how to lead this work in my organization. What advice would you give to our white brothers and sisters who are having this conversation, struggling with this conversation, trying to figure out what next to keep the movement going? What would you offer? And
well, I'm a firm believer in history. I mean, we should not overlook history because there are so many stories there that really indicate the power of people. When people make a decision to step up and do the things that are right, it is not just in the 21st century, but the 20th century, the 19th century. There are clear examples of Black and white people who have actually done what was right. But those stories are most not seldom told. So how do we get those stories told? How do we make history a part of it? And to clearly understand that our country itself is a country that was born out of protest and revolution. It wasn't born with a handshake between King George and whomever the governor of Massachusetts may have been. So the idea that we are struggling to get things right, that's what we've always done. That's what Shays' Rebellion was all about. So we have history literally tells us what moves us further down this road of progress. And I think we need to insert that so that it gives it some, I call it some backbone. And when we add to it, we are creating something that is legitimately real, not just a feeling, but really real. And I think people need to know the real history. And that is one thing we don't talk about.
Yeah, and I would just add on, because the history piece I think is so powerful. I think a lot of times people want to jump to action, and I don't think there's a process that looks the same for everyone, by the way, like that's not my point. But I do think for some people, like their first step is to learn the history. Their first step is to sit with this and to educate themselves and to understand, because what I have seen happening a lot is you have a lot of very well-meaning people who would say that they're woke and very, they get this and stuff. But when you're having conversation, their language, their actions, their behaviors actually don't show that they have done that work. And it's a journey for everyone. But I do think if we are going to be accomplices, if that's what we're saying we're going to be, and we want to be accomplice without understanding the history, without being mindful of the language that we're using, we're never going to fully be able to be that person because we're going to be short-sighted. And so I do think in this moment, there's a very powerful opportunity for people to really dive in and lean into the ability to learn the history, know the history. And then once there's an understanding, start understanding again, how does this play a role in my day to day? And I guarantee if you sit and think about your day from when you wake up to when you go to bed, from the media to news to when you're out and about with your families, you'll see so many things that are going to point to systemic barriers and injustices. And then you're going to be able to say, okay, I saw it through my day. Here's an action step that I can take to be a part of the solution.
Yeah, and then I'll say use these spaces to have those conversations as you are doing your learning, you know, because every time I learn something, I'm like, oh my God, like I have no idea. And I learn stuff about other cultures every single day. My mom was in the military. I was born in Germany. I lived in Korea. Like I learn stuff every single day, and it's so cool. And that's one thing I miss about the pandemic is that I'm not able to travel as much as I love to do. But the one thing I would caution is as you go through your learning, please don't just reach out to the one Black friend you have or the first Black person that comes to mind and ask them to be a part of that journey with you without asking them, right? Without asking them where they are, how their head is, what space they're in. Because, you know, having to put all that emotional weight on us, as Javon mentioned, is really taxing. And it's one where people need to not just assume that we want to be in that space with them. But these conversations are the perfect place to have them, you know, and maybe even doing a side dialogue afterwards with people who were here. That's very appropriate. So I just caution, it doesn't mean that Black folks don't want to have the conversation with you or brown folks or Indigenous people. It's just we are going through a lot right now. And so just enter with caution, with grace, humility, and ask if it's okay to have that conversation. And be okay if the answer is not right now or not with me. That's okay too. But do your work. And I gotta say, like, doing the work is so huge right now. We've got so much more to do. We have such an opportunity to make so many gains by just doing the work, asking the tough questions, and getting uncomfortable.
Yeah, and accompliceship is action, right? It's being a co-conspirator in the work. It's not sitting back and letting the person of color or the marginalized person speak up against something that's damaging or harming them. It's you speaking up before that even takes place. It's leveraging the power that you have within your organization, whatever sector that is, to do the right thing and guide your organization to getting where it needs to be as it relates to serving or just marginalized people within the organization. And so oftentimes we think that it's built like a new structure. It's using the structure that already exists to implement the change that needs to take place.
So this is kind of like the buzz round because we've got just a couple minutes left. And so just from your perspective, from each of your industries, one or two things that people could do to keep the momentum going, and then share with people how to connect with you after here. So let's start with Javon. From a higher education perspective, what are 2 action items that people can do to move the equity conversation forward from their vantage point? And then how does somebody continue to follow you or engage with you after this?
Definitely. So for institutions of higher education, I recommend building a strategic plan for inclusive excellence and social justice that is in alignment with your larger institutional strategic plan. I also recommend, and we're engaging in this right now at Arapahoe Community College, our leadership team for the college, so all the deans and vice presidents are going through an intentional equity and diversity training, right? So that our leadership is in the right place to lead these conversations with the greater college. You all know, if you're in the community college system, you know how to reach me, but I will drop my contact information in the chat box. I do some consulting around this work, and so I'm happy to work with you all in engaging, transforming your organization so that you're better meeting the needs of people of color.
Representative Herod, from a policy perspective, as a champion of the people, what are a couple things people can do to help continue this policy work, and how can folks get a hold of you?
Yeah. So the number one thing you could do is vote. And how about elect Black women? These are all my favorite hashtags. And you will have the opportunity to do so. So we are making shifts across the country. And I'm not just talking about at the highest level of office, but even at the lowest level, right? The first thing on your ballot, you need to make sure those are diverse places, because we need to make sure that there are people at the table who have diverse experiences. You know, I'm the first African-American LGBTQ person to hold elected office in Colorado, period. And it's important that we have our intersectional voices at the table. Now we have more people who have run and won who are Black queer people, right? That's amazing, but they wouldn't have done it. We wouldn't have done it if we didn't see someone else that we could emulate and aspire to be. So we have to continue to put people in these offices. So elect more women of color, elect more people of color, and ask a woman of color to run for office. Ask someone you respect to run for office and support them in that. That is amazing. And of course, just vote, you know, just turn out the vote. That is what you can do from a policy perspective. Figure out who your elected officials are and follow them on social media. Lift up what you agree with if you can, because sometimes a tweet can start a whole movement, right? You can change a whole policy platform. And so do that work. You'll see the results pretty quickly. And I put my information in the chat. You can reach me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm also available if you would like me to come and speak at any of your universities or institutions. I also do that work as well. So feel free to reach out. And thanks so much for having me.
Chelsea, so folks, a big conversation is, we got them here. How do we keep people here? How do we keep folks in our organization? What are one or two tips on the retention piece? And again, I know you've posted in the chats, but how can people reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh my gosh, this could be its own session, but I'll be quick because of time. So for the workplace piece, one really powerful report that just came out by Lean In, State of Black Women at Work. I'll try to drop it in before I leave, but you need to know what is happening in the reality within your organizations. This transcends public, private sector, and the like. Okay. So the first thing that I think is really important is, do you know the experience of your people of color? Like, have you spoke to them? Have you done focus groups? Have you done interviews? Do you know how they're doing? If you don't know, or if the answer is not like, yes, I've checked in, I understand the experience, that's step one. Okay. And then I think, you know, the things that precede that could be mentorship and sponsorship. People of color, particularly Blacks, are always less supported in organizations when it comes to advancement. From a mentorship and a sponsorship meaning helping a person get to that next level, like really advocating when they're not in the room. And so I think, again, if you don't have a formal program, or if certain people know about how to get ahead and other people don't, formalize and communicate that so that it's clear to everyone. My third one that I'll give you, again, because we're short on time, is we need policies that have no toleration for microaggressions. I have been horrified this entire season of the amount of particularly Black people, Black women to be very specific, who have LinkedIn me or emailed me and said, oh my gosh, my treatment at work, I've had enough. And so we typically talk about bias and discrimination, but I think we don't talk enough about microaggressions. What do they mean? What do they look like? How do they erode commitment, loyalty, and performance? And I think we need to start, any HR folk on here, have that policy very clear for folks. Managers, make sure your team knows we have no toleration for microaggressions, and create that consciously inclusive team that we need to make sure that Black people not only are in organizations, but they're able to advance, and that they're able to actually see themselves in the C-suite if that be their desire. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful.
And Clifton, from a business perspective, you're a CEO and you sit in a lot of boardrooms and know a lot of people. How do we diversify those boardrooms? How do more people of color end up in boardrooms? One or two tips on that, and how can people stay in touch with you?
Well, first of all, it's very important to have your voice there. I mean, there are some boards that I'm the only person who looks like me. And I often said, I wish there was 3, 4, 5, 6 more of us there, but I'm there. And it's important for me to be there, not just for myself, but for the constituency. And I'm using constituency now in the terms of my brothers and sisters. I want to be there. I am their voice there. And so I think being able to understand where your strengths are and being willing to volunteer, oftentimes the boards are volunteer boards, they're not paying boards. And so to be a volunteer because it can make a difference, especially if that organization is a charitable trust type, and many of the people that they can help or are helping look like me, I think I need to be there participating in that process. And i.e., I would say on voting. And this morning I did a check to make sure that I had made financial contributions to the people who look like me that were running for office. It's a lot to talk, but you got to write the check as well. So you want to do both of those things as well. And I think from the standpoint of just being in the business world, it's important to be able to just run a good company and be able to share what you've done with others. And as a writer, and having written 15 books, I would say my book, The Invitation, is what I would recommend for everyone to read, because it's the book that in President Obama's world, when he was president, they used it to celebrate the 50 years anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Publication. And it is one of the first books that deals with the thought pattern that Black people might have in a certain set of circumstances, and really follows it all the way through. And it is, for me, it has been quite revealing what has happened around the world, from Australia to South Africa, the response that we've gotten from people who says, you've written my story as well. So I go back to telling stories, writing the stories, reading the stories, determining who we are, and being willing to put our money there as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. You guys are absolutely tremendous. And thank you for taking some of your time to be here with us today. For all of you who are listening, I hope a couple of things stood out. First is just the role modeling of this conversation. We took an hour to come together to have a conversation. Take an hour out of your day, have a conversation in your organizations with the people you know. A couple of final thoughts. Global Minded is a fantastic organization doing this work. They have a newsletter where all kinds of stories and information is always being told. So tap into Global Minded. This panel will be recorded. It'll be in their newsletter tomorrow and on their YouTube page. So follow that up. As it relates to policy, remember, there is no perfect document. The Constitution had to be amended a bunch of times. Let me call attention to 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to be for example. So there are no perfect policies. So in your organizations, start looking at your policies. In the beginning, policies were racist. They've moved to race neutral. We have to move our policies to that of anti-racist policy. So you can't look at your policies too much. Getting comfortable being uncomfortable. How do you get comfortable doing that? It's like Shaquille O'Neal shooting a free throw. You practice. You practice. You put yourself into situations and you put yourself out there. You make yourself vulnerable. You live with grace, and you do something that's been coined recently, and it's, trying to end racial distancing. If you look in your circle and everybody looks like you, thinks like you, talks like you, walks like you, you should maybe think about spicing up your circle just a little bit. And you can do that in interactions. There are plenty of suggestions on how to do that, especially in this virtual world. The last thing that I'll leave you with is the concept of thriving, right? What does it mean to really thrive? When you look around you and you look in your organization, you look in your neighborhoods, you look in society where you engage, if people aren't thriving, that means you have an opportunity to engage in and do this work. Think about thriving, think about grace. Thank you for tuning into this conversation. There'll be more to come. I hope that you have some, and I'd love to be invited to your conversations to listen in or to be of service, as I know any of these panelists will as well. You guys have a fantastic day, and I want to turn it back over to Carol Carter.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, guys.
You guys did a great job, and I'm just thinking that we may do something that we don't normally do with these sessions, but I think that the people who attended would really appreciate, Ryan, if you wrote a follow-up that we could send out to the people who signed up for this, and put your 10, 15 best reads. We can link to some of our articles, and just give people kind of a little mini virtual toolkit that they can share with their departments or people in their companies or whatever, that we can operationalize immediately some of the things you all discussed. So let's do that for sure. And I want to also share that next week we're going to be looking at other issues that are related to inclusive leadership, like mobility and the food deserts and housing and some of the other things that we know if we don't solve those things in a bigger strategic way, we can't create opportunity for a lot of the talented people that we all care about and want to serve. So you can look for some information on that by the end of this week. Those sessions will be happening next week. But we really value this group that was here today. And Ryan, maybe we should do this once a month because people might just come together and want to have the conversation continuing with some measurable deliverables that we can start to benchmark. So let's explore all of that. And thanks to all of you for making the time. And Javon and Clifton, Leslie, Chelsea, Ryan, it's so great to have you guys as part of our several thousand person inclusive community. So let's just keep the ball rolling and we'll plan from here. Thanks everybody.
Thank you everybody. Have a fantastic week. Leave with love.
Take care, be well.
Okay.
Thank you, Clifton,
I
Javon.
did.
Ryan.
Thank you guys so much.
I'm
Thank you.
so glad you're here. I only had intention.
That was an all-star panel.
That was so good. I'm going to connect with all of you on LinkedIn and over email, okay?
Definitely. Sounds good.
Right on.
Have a good one. Be safe.
You do the
You
same.
too.
You be safe out there in New York. Put that mask on.
Right.
I am.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. I appreciate you, sir.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right.